Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for coming. It's quite a privilege for me to introduce Yara, who I had the opportunity to meet last year for the first time. About a week ago, in dealing with the planning, I wrote an email to Tina, and we were discussing the excitement about the event coming up. And one of the things I shared with her when she asked me, was I excited? I said, you know, I think I feel like a kid on Christmas week. And that's because, selfishly, I must admit that this is a gift to you, but also to myself. Each presentation is a gift to me that adds something along my journey in self-discovery and my identity development as an Afro-Deutsche Frau. How about that? Can't say Afro-German. I learned that this morning. Why Yara is so important to me personally is because reading her work was the first time I had the opportunity to read in print a story that was my story, or a piece of my history, in particular, as one of the children born during the occupation period that was adopted and brought to the United States. So learning about those who remained in Germany is one piece of the story, but again, it meant something so significant to me to have the opportunity to meet the person who I had been reading about that had written about me. So now I will introduce her to you. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Yara-Colette Lemke Muniz de Faria. Yara is a historian, curator, and archivist, currently working at the photographic collection of the German Historical Museum in Berlin. She is the author of numerous publications on Black Germans in the post-war period, and she is arguably the most influential scholar of post-war Black German history. Her book, Zwischen Vorzüge und Ausgrenzung, Afrodeutsche Besatzungskinder in Nachkriegsdeutschland, Metropolverlag 2002, was a groundbreaking study of the fate of Afro-German children of African-American GIs that introduced many to the history of this group, including me. Her publications in English also include Black German Occupation Children, Objects of Study in the Continuity of German Race Anthropology, in Children of World War II, The Hidden Enemy Legacy, edited by Kjersti Eriksen, Eva Simonson, Berg Publishers in 2005. Germany's Brown Babies Must Be Helped, Will You? U.S. American Adoptions of Afro-German Children, 1950 to 1955, in Black Voices Against Social Exclusion. Edited by Tina Kampt, special issue, Kalaloo, Journal of African Diaspora Arts and Letters in Texas, 2003. Lemke Muniz de Faria, Blacks, Germans, and the Politics of Imperial Imagination, 1920 to 1960, in the Imperialist Imagination, German Colonialism and Its Legacy, Friedrichsmeyer, Sarah Linnick, Sarah Santop, Suzanne, in the University of Press of 1998. The title of Yara's lecture today is In Their Best Interest, Afro-German Children in Post-War German Children's Homes. So without further ado, I introduce to you Yara.
Good afternoon. Just putting on the watch. Okay. I'm ready now. Thank you very much for this lovely introduction, Rosemary. Thank you very much to all the organizers to put up this beautiful and very important event. Thanks very much to the Max Kade Foundation who made it possible for me to be here. And Rosemary, just on a personal note, I just learned that you will introduce me, and I think this is very special to be introduced by you because you are a member of, just a beloved generation of Black Germans to me. It's a generation that I've done research on for, I think, about the last 20 years. And last year was the first time at the first Black Convention that I actually had you and other adoptees in front of me. I mean, just alive, and I had a chance to talk to you and learn more about your history from your perspective and not from the perspective of social workers, German institutions, just like official institutions, but just Black German experiences. And so that was lovely to be introduced by you. Thanks a lot. So let me tell you a little bit more about Black German history and Black German experience of this particular generation, the generation that was born right after the war, the Second World War. Much of my research on Afro-German history has concentrated until very recently more on the structures and actions of state and private welfare institutions on behalf on and in response to the post-war children of African-American GIs and German women. My focus has been on the question of why this relatively small group of children, sorry, I forgot to put on my watch, of why this relatively small group of children received such immense and disproportionate attention to the point that individuals in Germany and abroad developed programs intended to shape the lives of about almost 5,000 Black German children via transatlantic adoption or separation within Germany. In keeping with the theme of this year's convention, I'll be highlighting a number of archival sources that offer unique insights into the Black German experience, specifically a selection of autobiographical texts, letters, postcards, interviews, and films. In short, sources produced by Afro-Germans themselves which present their unique experiences. In this keynote, I'll be concentrating on a group of Afro-German children raised in Germany, though not with their birth families. I'll be focusing on children raised in the 1950s in religious and private orphanages, and in particular on the children raised in a very unique private home known as the Albert Schweitzer Children's Home for Mixed-Race Children. I'll be deviating slightly from the title I originally gave to the conference organizers for a very important reason, because just a few months ago, in January 2012, the German government established a 120 million euro fund to compensate individuals raised in German children's homes. 800,000 Germans raised in orphanages in the 1950s and 60s are eligible to receive funds to cover therapy and other medical expenses as compensation for traumas suffered during their residence in these institutions. Given the fact that there were at least 640 Black German children living in these homes in the 1950s, it seems particularly important to highlight the specific circumstances of these children in the context of this recognition of the experiences of orphans living in children's homes in this period. So let me begin by just very briefly sketching out the historical context. Most of you are familiar with some of the figures I'm mentioning now, but between 1945 and 1955, we know that, according to statistics, 4,776 children were born to German women and African American soldiers in occupied Germany. These children were, according to German law, granted the citizenship of their German mothers. But due to their illegitimate birth, most of these children were classified as wards of the state and placed under the supervision of a guardian of the state welfare agency. Debates about the existence and future of Afro-German children in post-war Germany were based on a particular perception of these children as blacks or racially mixed, which constituted them as alien, deviant, and foreign. As a consequence, the dominant perception articulated by most social welfare agencies, scholars, governmental officials, and the media in the first years after the war, these children were seen as not belonging or at risk in Germany, which led many to advocate for the emigration of Afro-German children through foreign adoption, preferably to their father's country, or at the very least, to a country with a predominantly black population, where they would be among themselves, among their own people, or for their placement in special facilities like segregated children's homes and school classes. These approaches mandated a dynamic of care and marginalization at the same time. Segregation in particular was presented as a solution that would offer more protective and nurturing environments for their wards. For segregated orphanages were claimed to be in the best interest of the children. In order to get a more concrete picture of the situation in 1950, the Federal Office of Youth Welfare collected data on the birthplace and living situation of all Afro-German children under their supervision. And the following conclusions were drawn based on the results of the survey. A majority of the children were born in the south of Germany, in Bavaria, followed by Baden-Württemberg and Hesse, each of which belonged to the American occupation zone, the site of the largest US deployments. The chart on the right-hand side shows that most children lived with their mothers, which led to the second conclusion: nearly 65% of the mothers were not willing to surrender their custodial rights and allow the children to be sent to the US for adoption. This was the most important outcome of the survey, as it effectively stopped all discussion of a collective exportation of the children abroad. The chart also shows that 10% of the children lived with relatives, in most cases their grandparents, and about 25%, and that is 1/4 of all children, were living with foster parents or in children's homes. Breaking this down even more precisely, approximately 14%, and that's the 639 or 640 of the Afro-German children counted in the survey, were living in public children's homes, most of them homes run by the Catholic or Protestant church, the Caritas or the Inner Mission. So why did mothers decide to place their Afro-German children in children's homes? Many of the reasons why Afro-German children were given into a public or parochial care are largely identical to the reasons motivating mothers to give up their children for adoption to the US. For example, the child was unwanted by the new husband or the returning husband. The mother was unable to care for the child, but there were also reasons specific to the situation of Black German children. For example, the mothers were convinced a better future awaited their child in the US. Grandparents, for age-related reasons, couldn't take care of their grandchildren anymore, or caregivers didn't accept an Afro-German grandchild. Or mothers were pushed by social welfare workers to put children into care. The last of these points was particularly widespread and is clearly illustrated in 2 short film clips that I'd like to show you now. The clips give a vivid example of popular perception in the 1950s and demonstrate the manner in which youth service workers dealt with mothers of Afro-German children. In the first clip, you will hear a female voice in the background, which belongs to Dr. Rehling during a debate of the German parliament, in which she states, Among other concerns, there's the fact that the mixed-race children are ill-suited to the climate here. It has been suggested that it would be better for these children to relocate them to the homeland of their fathers. So this is just a background voice. The second clip is totally in German, and unfortunately of a very bad quality, but I still decided to show it to you because it shows a social worker who visits different mothers of Afro-German children and asking them about their ideas about their children's future, and repeatedly asking if they would like to give their children up for adoption, and if not, why not? So here comes the first clip.
The first occupation babies are born as early as the spring of 1946, and many are black, the so-called brown babies. They are born in a country where racial hostility has been out of control for years, and even the American occupational force strictly segregates black and white. Children are a taboo subject in the young Federal Republic of Germany in a social as well as political sense. Racist undertones are unmistakable.
Die verantwortlichen Stellen der freien und behördlichen Jugendpflege haben sich schon seit Jahren Gedanken über das Schicksal dieser Mischlingskinder gemacht, denen schon allein die klimatischen Bedingungen in unserem Land nicht gerecht sind. Man hat erwogen, ob es nicht besser für sie sei, wenn man sich das Heimatland ihrer Väter verrechnet.
The German authorities are no less harsh in their treatment of the brown babies. Children born out of wedlock in Germany are under the supervision of youth welfare offices, and they frequently support adoptions from abroad. Unmarried mothers have very few rights.
In dieser Art haben wir einmal Präsidenten durch eine jugendliche Leidenschaft dienen. Hier ist alles sauber und ordentlich. Mein Hund hat gar nicht unwürdig. Und wir stellen das nicht die gleichen Fragen wie im Wagen ab. Wie heißt es so jetzt? 4 Jahre. Und früher Vater, da haben meine Tochter für einen Sohn. Nein, und da kann man nicht. Und das ist wie viel Kunden da so im Monat. Und macht er auch 30 Pound, oder? Ne? Und wie ist es? Und das ist die gleichen Antworten, das gleiche menschliche Problem. Und man könnte vielleicht erwarten, dass diese Mütter sich leichter zu entschließen, ihre Kinder wegzugeben, sie adoptieren zu lassen.
So this type of encounter with social workers is no exception. It was much more characteristic of the norm. Mothers were systematically pressured to give their children up for adoption or put them in homes. This was always argued to be in the best interests of the child, since it was assumed that they would be alienated at school and had no real future in Germany. Only if the children were grouped together would they supposedly be able to develop a healthy form of identity and be able to defend themselves against the racism of other children and adults. Ika Hügel-Marshall recalls in her autobiography, Invisible Women, the visits of the social worker in her home vividly. She was born in March 1947 in a small town in Bavaria and lived with her mother, her grandmother, her German stepfather, and her younger white sister, as shown in the left picture. Like all children born out of wedlock, Ika Hügel-Marshall was a ward of the state. And as a ward of the state, a social worker from youth services regularly visited her family. Ika Hügel-Marshall had just entered primary school at the age of 5 when the social worker pressured her mother to put her daughter into care. And she writes, and I cite the social worker talking to her mother. This is no reflection on your abilities as a mother, Frau Popp. Surely you know how people are in small towns, how they talk. Please allow me to give you some very sound and serious advice, and please remember that I am the director of youth services here and in charge of such things. In short, I urge you to let your daughter go. It's the right thing. Send her to a place where she can grow up without the burdens she would face here. People can be hateful and mean, believe me. The best thing for both of you would be to place her where she'll be spared contact with such people. She'll never amount to anything if she stays here with you, trust me. It's for the best. And do you want the best for your daughter? Don't you? You love her, don't you, Frau Popp? Responding to Ika's mother's question of how she should explain to her daughter that it would be better for her to grow up in an orphanage far away from her family, the social worker responded, Frau Popp, it's the best for her. She's got no future in this town. When she's older, she may become emotionally unstable, and she'll certainly be considered free game for the men. She'll end up having children out of wedlock, become an alcoholic, and and God knows what else. Is that what you really want? And please, don't forget, Frau Popp, that you have another daughter. If you keep Erika here, you'll be endangering her development as well. When it comes down to it, it was your decision to bring another Negermischling into a hostile world. And finally, Frau Popp, if you can't make the decision for yourself, I'm afraid we'll have to make it for you. Clearly, sending Ika to a children's home was not a suggestion, but it was a threat. If Ika's mother did not agree, she would be taken away over her objections, an act that in fact had no legal basis. Under immense pressure and with a deep conviction that she would be giving her daughter a better future, Ika's mother allowed her daughter to be placed in an orphanage at the age of 6. Ika was raised in the German orphanage Kinderheimat Gotteshütte, God's Little Cabin's children's home, where she was the only black child until she left the home at the age of 18. And on the right-hand picture, it's her on the stoops in front of the home. Contrary to the arguments of her social worker, the orphanage did not have the intended effect of strengthening her identity. As I mentioned earlier, of the 800,000 children living in care in Germany in the 1950s and 60s, at least 639 were Afro-German. These children were often the victims of abuse and racist attacks from both other children and staff members. Hugo Marshall's book describes such abuse as beginning on her very first day in the orphanage, when she was physically and verbally abused. She recounts being beaten, her hands being tied, being called a miserable bastard, a Hottentot, and her mother being a nigger whore. She describes experiencing a physical abuse aimed at driving out the devil within her because of her Negro blood. And she writes, "For years I suffer nightmares. I'm afraid of myself. I'm afraid of the dark. Everywhere I imagine little black devils. Behind the cellar door, in the basement, under my bed, in my book bag in the morning before school, at school, anytime something goes awry, when I'm alone. I'm afraid the devils will sneak up and capture me, torture me, and throw me in a deep, dark grave. I'm 10 years old and I'm riddled with guilt. I hate the color of my skin." This is only one example of the abuse she describes suffering in the children's home over the 12 years that she was there. Summarizing her experience, she describes her time in the children's home quite simply as hell. It was a very different experience for the children who lived for a couple of years in the Albert Schweitzer Kinderheim, the ASK, founded in North Rhine-Westphalia in 1952, a year before Ika was sent to live in Gotteshütte. The founder of the home, Irene Dillo, was a minister's wife and mother of 9 children of her own. While working as a counselor for war widows, she met the mother of an Afro-German child in 1952, whose partner would not marry her because of her child. In researching the woman's options for putting her child into care, Dillo recognized that Afro-German children were frequently abused or alienated in care, and she came to embrace the opinion of social workers that special care and protective measures should be undertaken regarding these children. Yet Dillo rejected the idea of foreign adoption, as she felt that Germans should take care of their own rather than exporting their problems abroad. Her solution was to create a separate space for Black German children, a children's village, where the children would be protected from cruelty and alienation. Her aim was the creation of a place that integrated home, school, and professional education, with an emphasis on the children's learning foreign languages for their future voluntary immigration abroad. And we might want to discuss this concept later, which again speaks up the idea of the children having no future in Germany. But right now, more important for us is the fact that Irene Dillo's Children's Village differed significantly from the aims and structures of public and parochial children's homes. Dillo diligently and persistently appealed to national and international state, religious and private organizations and individuals for financial and other forms of support toward establishing her children's village. Among other luminaries, she enlisted the help of Louis Armstrong, Josephine Baker, Nat King Cole, and Mary McLeod Bethune, who she wrote to in her campaign for support, some of whom held benefit events or even took on personal sponsorships of children. Walter White, the president of the NAACP, was less supportive, since the idea of a segregated home contradicted the NAACP's own campaign against Jim Crow and its historic Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education. Irene Dillo's original goal of founding a children's village for 200 children was never realized. Yet, from its opening in 1955 to its closure in 1959, the ASK was home to an average of 35 to 40 children between 2 and 11 years old. Despite the publicly expressed rejection of the Children's Village, individual youth service bureaus embraced and supported the transfer of a small group of their Afro-German wards. After an initial 3-year planning phase, the first group of 8 children moved into the home in Wuppertal-Bergholz on February 1st, 1955. All of the children were transferred by the Nuremberg Youth Service Bureau, and this group was followed by children from Cologne, Wuppertal, Detmold, Stuttgart, and other cities. And in June 1955, the ASK officially opened with 16 residents. The majority of children came from other homes and orphanages from all over Germany. Others were brought by their mothers, and some were found on the steps of the home, as the former managing director of the ASK, Horst Möbius, recalls. In one case, Irene Dillo personally facilitated the transfer of a child from an orphanage to the ASK. As one ASK child later wrote in a letter, "I lived with my mother and her husband in W until I was 4 years old. I was put into the orphanage because my stepfather abused me. Then I was abused by the nuns. Pastor Dillo and his wife found me and took me away to the ASK in Wuppertal-Bergholz. There were about 18 to 22 mixed kids there. There were kids who came from the worst family situations, children who had lice or who were found in coal cellars." The press reports in Germany on the opening of the home were overall positive. Revue magazine was enthusiastic and published a very positive report well before the opening of the home in an article entitled "Don't Mock Them Anymore." The article described Irene Dillo as mastering one of the most difficult post-war problems in Germany. The newsletter of the Inner Mission stated that in this home, Afro-German children can grow up to be spiritually healthy individuals. Without the perception of this special home, they would develop anxiety and persecution complexes and would become neurotic, disruptive, and distrustful children unable to establish normal relationships to other children their age, and a constant unsolvable problem to their teachers. What percentage of these children, the paper asks, will become asocial, drift into criminality, torture themselves and those around them to the point of being a constant threat and burden? It is the responsibility of the German people to solve this dangerous problem. These articles exemplify the reception of the press to the ASK. Caring for these Black German children in their own special facility was valued as a singular contribution to their survival. The source of their potential demise, the racism of white German society, was acknowledged, but a strategy for addressing this problem was not taken up. It was easier to remove Afro-German children from the threat posed by white German society and celebrate this as a necessary protective measure for the good of the children. To give you a small peek into the world of the ASK, I'd now like to show you a short film clip. It's just 1 minute long, but I'm really happy that I can show it to you.
Ein kleines Haus im modernen Stil. Albert Schweitzer, der berühmte Menschenfreund in Afrika, gab seinen Namen für diese erste Schule für Geschwister ehemaliger Besatzungsangehöriger, die Burgdorf bei Wuppertal. 20-farbige Besatzungslieder aus Bayern, Hessen und Westfalen haben hier eine Heimat gefunden, wo der Spott einer gedankenlosen Umwelt ihre Kinderseele nicht vergiften kann.
The positive response to the ASK was unfortunately only short-lived. In June of 1955, only 4 months after its opening, the first letters of complaint about the leadership of the home were received by the Central Committee of the Inner Mission. Youth welfare workers complained that there was no proper supervision of the children, who were insolent, spoiled, and wild, and had no manners. The home itself was seen to be more of a camp than a children's home. Yet, the major criticism was that the children did not attend the local public school and received private instruction in the home that was not considered to meet adequate education standards. However, according to the comments of one social worker, it also needed to be taken into consideration that the children's behavior rapidly improved over the course of their stay at the home. She noted that many of the children who arrived scared and shy were later observed to be confident, trusting, and happy. Nevertheless, in July of 1956, the ASK was unexpectedly evicted by the German Federation of Welfare Associations in Germany, who stated that they intended to use the property for other purposes. Yet the reason for the eviction had more to do with mounting criticism in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, where Irene Dillo's extremely liberal approach to education was seen as unacceptable. Irene Dillo reacted immediately by acquiring a property with multiple buildings in the new Asel area of Hesse. So she moved to another state. And so the film was shot in the first home, and this is after they moved to Hesse. The new home was financed primarily through private contributions and from members of the ASK Foundation, in addition to the small amount of funding Dillo received from the state. Unlike in their previous location, the children of the ASK attended public school together with other children in the area. Again, newspapers and magazines in Germany and the US reported in a very positive way about the children's home, which had grown to 31 children by 1958. And this is an article that was published in the Münchner Illustrierte in 59, and also Ebony magazine, who reported for the whole post-war decade on the so-called brown babies in Germany. So they had this report about them, very positive report about the children's home. But the move to Hesse only exacerbated the conflict between Irene Dillo and the Youth Welfare Service. The Hessian Youth Bureau accused Dillo of violating paragraph 95 of the Right Youth Welfare Act, which required her to hire state-certified teachers and care workers. Dillo did, in fact, systematically violate the Youth Bureau's rules, for example, by hiring certified employees only to fire them 2 weeks later. In 1957, the state drew the line and threatened to close the home. Looking at the history of the ASK up until this point, it appears that Irene Dillo, who at the time was over 70 years old, had taken on the role of self-appointed protector of 30 to 40 Afro-German children in her care. While actively searching for a long-term home for the project, she was persistently hounded by state welfare officials and found herself moving the home from one state to the next. The question is why? Why did Dillo go to such great lengths to avoid adhering to the rules of the youth welfare services? The reason was that Dillo fundamentally rejected the child-rearing policies of the state, for they directly contradicted her own far more open approach. Instead of a traditional emphasis on order and discipline, Dillo prioritized cultivating emotional connections to the children in her care, even if this led to a more disruptive and less organized daily routine within the home itself. Dillo saw herself as grandma to all of her foster children, as someone who they trusted and sought advice from, and as the organizer and protector of all of their affairs. Nothing took priority over her kids, not even her own birth children. Dillo's youngest son recalled that at garden parties or on vacation, She used her own children as a means to an end. It was almost impossible to come to her with your own problems, which led to some jealousy toward the foster children. Even on her deathbed in 1964, Irene Dillo used her visiting hours to counsel an Afro-German child. While her own children took great pains to visit her, often traveling many miles to see her in hospital, they were often forced to leave after a few minutes. She repeatedly told them that her Afro-German children needed her, for her own children were now grown up and would have to fend for themselves. Irene Dillo was able to keep the home above water for almost 2 more years, but there were numerous incidents that eventually contributed to its demise. For example, in late 1958, children from the ASK were picked up by youth services on their way home from school and transferred to another home. Dillo tried in vain to have them returned, but was banned from entering the other home and never allowed to see the children again. This incident was followed shortly afterwards by the final closure of the ASK. Within 4 weeks, child welfare officers in Bavaria, in Hesse, in North Rhine-Westphalia took custody of all of the children and placed them in multiple homes in their respective regions. Yet the closure of the ASK was just the start of a new chapter of engagement for Irene Dillo. In 1960, she founded the International Union of Mixed-Race Children, the Internationale Mischlingsunion, a counseling center for Afro-German youth that thought to support these children in their dealings with social welfare organizations. Hundreds of mothers and children and teenagers enlisted the organization's help, and Irene Dillo set up files for each inquiry, many of which included personal correspondence, cards, photographs, handmade drawings, employment applications, as well as correspondence with social welfare agencies and individual social workers. A large number of letters contained in the Dillo estate were comprised of thank you notes for clothing, books, and candy sent by Irene Dillo. These letters came from mothers and children who had never met Irene Dillo. So while many were initially addressed to Frau Dillo or to the vice president of the organization, by the second or third letter, many referred to her as dearest Grandma Dillo. Above all, the children who had lived at the ASK persistently kept in contact with Dillo, as her estate contains numerous letters with accounts of how the children were doing since the closure of the home. All of the children from the ASK were placed in homes in the various states where they had originally resided. Yet, all of their correspondence with Irene Dillo expressed how deeply they missed both Dillo and the home. It is unfortunate to find, however, that their letters also tell a similar story to that told by Ika Hügel about their experience following their departure from the ASK, and I'd like to cite just from 2 of them. So Gundi H. wrote in October 1960 from Schmeitach, "Dear Grandma, I can finally write you a letter. I just got to school. How am I doing? I'm not doing well here. They read all of our letters here, both the ones we write and the ones we receive. Please tell Mickey to write me, but please don't send a postcard. I'd really like to take the job you told me about in the doctor's office. Please do write me, but not on a postcard. I really miss you, believe me, I do." And 2 years later, she wrote from Nuremberg, "It wasn't very nice at the home in Schmeitach, and I often wanted to run away. I even went so far that I slashed my wrists and had to go to the doctor because I was unconscious. But please don't tell anyone. How are you and how are the others? I'd really love to come and visit in the summer, can I?" And Heidemarie P. wrote in October 1960 a long letter from Augsburg, and I will cite from that too. "Dear Grandma and Grandpa Dillo, I was in Nuremberg for a year. Then I went to a farm in Martinsberg. Grandma, believe me, it was not a nice place. It looked like a castle. Girls threw themselves out the windows. the head of the home, beat us and made us stand in the corner until midnight. My group leader hit me the most, and I scratched and bit. We were like animals in that home. I almost lost my mind there. Grown men were beating 14 and 15-year-old girls on their naked bottoms. It was horrible. One girl jumped from the 5th floor and broke both legs, arms, and her spine, and she'll never walk again. One girl punched her fist through a glass window that tore up her hand. Grandma, life has been really hard for me. Then my mother took me back again, but it didn't work out. They gave me food and clothes, but my father always beat me up, and often he undressed me. I jumped from the 3rd floor and broke my arm. I slashed my wrists, took pills, all for nothing. Then I visited my grandma during the vacation and never wanted to leave. Humiliation, incarceration, beatings, sexual abuse, suicide attempts, running away, and desperation are what many of the former ASK children experienced following their departure from the home. In 2006, Peter Wenzierski's book, Beatings in the Name of the Lord, was published in Germany. The book contained the first published testimonies of former residents of Catholic and Protestant children's homes and institutions, who described the multiple forms of abuse they experienced in the 1950s and 60s. The book catalogs unspeakable and inhuman forms of cruelty, of children who were made to eat their own vomit, who were tied to their beds for weeks, who were abused and forced to take drugs for years, to mention just a few examples of everyday praxis in numerous children's homes, all perpetrated under the guise of Christian beliefs. The severe psychic scars and illnesses that often led to demands for restitution from the German government and the two major churches who ran these institutions. The result was the establishment, just a few months ago, of a 120 million euro fund to compensate victims. The fund was set up by the German government and the churches responsible for these homes, and allocates up to 10,000 euros per person for treatment. Ika Hügel-Marschall is one of those who claimed this compensation. She is one of at least 640 Afro-German children raised in institutional care. It is unclear exactly how many Black German children there were in these institutions, and their individual fate is equally difficult to establish. Hügel-Marschall's autobiography and the letters of the children of the ASK are valuable sources that document a painful but important chapter of Black German experience and of German and Black German history. But the final and perhaps most important question raised by my talk is, so what's the point in recounting this difficult, if not traumatic, history? When I spoke with Rosemary about the subject of my talk, she shared with me a very important sentiment. She said, we adoptees here in the US are very interested in learning more about the children who grew up in Germany. And it was Rosemary's comments that led me to write the keynote about the Albert Schweitzer Kinderheim and those who supported this particular home. Just as I began working, the compensation fund for former children in institutional care was established. And the significance of this acknowledgement of the abuse of these children made it important for me to highlight the hidden history of the ASK and that of other Afro-Germans in public care. I'm keenly aware that some of what I have presented is shocking and heartbreaking, yet I believe it is important to discuss all kinds of Afro-German experience, both positive and negative, in order to get a deeper understanding of Afro-German and German history. Shining a light on the cruelties Afro-Germans in institutional care suffered empowers us to question the arguments which led German society to support the institutionalization of their Black German children. It allows us to question and dispute who gets to determine the best interest of these children. And maybe the most important about research on Afro-German history, even if it's painful, is these records allow us to learn more about our history as a community and as individuals. And when we know where we have come from, we can even be prouder of our accomplishments and where we are today, both as a community and as individuals. So I want to end this keynote by introducing you to just 4 outstanding Black Germans. 2 of them were adopted to the US at a very young age, and 2 of them grew up in Germany. And I'm grateful to all of them for their courage to speak up and write their autobiographies, make movies about their lives, or just becoming a very central figure in getting us all together. So on the top we have Rosemary Painter, president of the Black German Cultural Society, organizer of the first convention, heart of the community, the transatlantic Black German community. On the bottom we have Dan Cardwell, who I was very lucky to meet last year. He's also an adoptee, published his autobiography, and he made a just fantastic film which won Best Documentary at the Black American Film Festival last year. It's called Brown Babies, The Michelinskinder Story. And it's about 6 children, especially 6 children who were adopted to the family, the Cardwell family, to Washington, D.C. And here we have, of course, Ika Hügel Marshall, who wrote her very important autobiography, which is also published in English, was translated into English. She's not only an author and many other things, but she's also just a beautiful artist. That's why I put this up there. And on the bottom you have Charles Graf. He is the little boy that you saw in that film clipping. He became a very famous boxer at the age of 17, but then unfortunately went into drugs and like serious drug problems, and he spent 10 or 12 years in jail. But today, he just published his autobiography last year, and right now he's working with youth in not children's homes. What is it? Auffällige Jugendliche. Yeah, and so his autobiography is called, Fight for Your Life. So I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Will you take questions?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, do you want to
There
sit or do you want to stand? Or do you want me to moderate?
Whatever. What do you want?
We have
Okay.
We have time for a few questions, and I'll ask Yara to come sit and take a look. There's one question here.
That was a great presentation. For those of us who don't speak German, there was a part in the film clip number 2 with the first mother that evoked a large reaction from the audience, especially right in front of me here. Can anybody elaborate on what happened there?
He was asking about, in the first clip, the circus, the comment to explain what was happening during that particular clip when people reacted so strongly to the suggestion of the circus.
Yeah, it's, he keeps pushing, I hope you got the sense of his pushing manner. He just said, what are your plans for the future of your child? So can you imagine what is going to happen to your child? So what are you planning? And your child, do you want, it can't go to the circus, or do you want your child to go to a circus? And the circus was a very racist perception of black Germans being born by genetics as artists. You know, just like
Trapeze artists and things.
yeah, trapeze artists. Yeah, just traveling around like the traveling, this reisende Volk. You know,
Yeah, like nomadic people.
yeah, nomadic people,
Yeah.
and being something to watch, to look at for the entertainment of others. Yeah, yeah, being on display.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so they couldn't imagine anything else. It wouldn't have popped up in their head that they could become teachers or a dentist or, I don't know, even a saleswoman or a secretary. It was just one picture was circus. So do you want your child to go to circus?
Peggy, you have a question, and then there's one in front.
Many of these children were born in the late 50s or early 60s? Is that, or late 50s or, I'm sorry,
What
late
years were
40s.
they born?
Late
Yeah.
40s.
The time frame
Occupied.
that I'm talking about is
Right.
between 1945 and 1960.
Okay.
There are about 5,000 children born.
So many of these children are still alive. What's the legacy of this in Germany? How do the attitudes evolve since then? And what's sort of the attitude today?
So,
Ja, was mit ihnen heute ist. Ja.
Yeah, and how have attitudes in Germany towards them changed or remained the same? Is that your question?
At this particular generation, you mean, or just in general?
Can you describe the evolution since the 50s, in the 60s and in the 70s, and what's happening today?
Okay, I can't answer this question is because I really focus on the post-war generation, which is, I think, it's a very special generation because they're the first ones born after the war. In the 60s, you have a complete different situation because there are a lot of African students coming into the country. In the 70s, we have Turkish immigration. So I think, you know, it's the first generation after the war. They had to take it all. They are the ones who have to deal with the, you know, with people who were in the 30s they were Nazis. I mean, they were still in this children's home. They're still the same people working there, and their perceptions of blacks. And I'm not saying that not even today the perception of Germans, for example, is much different because that's what we just heard on the panel. Of course, I mean, you're still questioned, you know, if you're German because the German can't be black. Still today, even in Berlin. But yeah, so I cannot tell you about the 60s and 70s.
But today there is even the perception that the German cannot be black.
Yeah, it depends where you are. If you're in Berlin and, you know, going around hang out with your friends from the ISD, Initiative Schwarze Deutsche, then, you know, they might not question or ask you, but if you're on your own, I can tell you just, I'm working at a big museum, actually the largest national German, a museum for German history. And when I started there 2 years ago, I was very happy because I was getting a new computer. And the guy who brought the computer into the room, and I was on my own in the room, it was really a big office place. He said, well, I'm bringing the computer for Frau Lemke. I said, cool, that's me. That was fast. He said, no, it's for Frau Lemke. I said, yeah, it's for me. He said, I could watch him and I saw that Frau Lemke, which is a very typical German name, and me, and his order to deliver the computer, it just didn't go together. He was, but no, it's for Frau Lemke. And, you know, that's, what can I say? That happened 2 years ago.
Peggy, you had a question right here?
Thank you very much. That was great, and I think especially the clips, what they also showed as in the 50s, or in the late 40s and 50s, is this whole notion of racism and race to be, on the one hand, totally erased from the German discourse, and on the other hand, it was still totally okay. While we all could not discriminate against Jewish people anymore, and that was a big, big taboo, because we just got out of the shock of the Holocaust, the notion of race of the pre-war time is all over the place in this clip. So I thought this was really, you could see that, like the circus, also the reference to the freaks, basically. That is what your kid, your child is a freak, so is that what you want to have it ended up? And I found it particularly interesting, even your case studies of this Frau Irene Dillo, that they titled or named their project Albert Schweitzer. I mean, the colonial period, I mean, we are still struggling to actually bring that back into the history and reading history, German history. But at the time, in the late 40s and 50s, that was totally legit to go back to the colonial area, and actually having this whole scenario of Albert Schweitzer brings it even in a different setting. That was just a comment. Thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah, it was even worse because actually she called it Klein Lambarene. Lambarene was the village in Uganda for people with leprosy. And she was just so in awe with Albert Schweitzer and his, idea of helping the poor blacks. And she wrote to him, and I have the letter, she wrote to him and asked him for advice for her home. And he came up with the idea, so just train them in foreign languages, because then they're able to voluntarily leave the country. And that's what I said. See, when I got the estate from this children's homes, and when I started working with it, I was very, very critical of this home for the longest time. I even wrote on it, and it's completely different from what I just told you. It's more an analysis of a person who thinks she is meant from her Christian background to help these poor blacks and keep them and protect them and make them ready to leave the country because they do not belong to Germany. And so that differs so much from the ones who say, well, they're better off in Africa in the first place, or in a country with a large black population. But I had to change my mind a little bit just because I read a lot about state institutions, orphanages. And it's a horror. If you read it, it's just terrible, terrible. And I cut out most of the really bad stories out of the talk. And in the context of that, her home is so special that I really don't care anymore. If she thought this idea of a children's village and train them in foreign languages, these kids were never trained in any language. They spoke German, they were in Germany, they were loved, they were respected, they were always touching her. She was always embracing them and cuddling them. And the letters, they really tell you, these are not letters written by kids who were told to, just send her an email. Oh my God. Oh my God. That much about me being a historian. Sit down and write a card, make draw nice flowers. I mean, they came from the bottom of their hearts. And so I thought, I'll leave that out. I don't have to criticize her for her ideas. I just value what she did. And I can tell, and I truly believe that for these children, it was the best time they had in their young lives. Because before that and after that home, they had a terrible time. And yeah.
There's a question, and then there's one there. Wait for the mic.
I was just wondering about the film clips, about the conversations with the social workers. I was wondering if those are part of the documentary that you mentioned afterwards, Mischlingskinder, or are they accessible in any?
They're the first ones, the first two ones, they're done by the Westdeutsche Rundfunk, and I actually got them from one I got from a friend, and the other one I just stole. I cut it out of another film because the third clip, the 1 minute clip, I just put a lot of effort to get it. It's a minute long, and they wanted a lot of money. I found it in an archive, and through Tina's help and support, and we bought the clip. I could have not afforded to show the other ones, so don't tell anybody.
We won't.
But they are accessible. They're in the archives. But you pay per second, so you can imagine.
Thank you, Yara, for this keynote. I actually have a question related to Charlie Graf, who is mentioned twice. Actually, his mom gives this interview to this ridiculous, answers this ridiculous question of this guy. And then you mentioned him at the very end of your keynote when you talked, you introduced his biography. So I'm actually just wondering, did you see this film called Ein Schwarzer Boxer, where there's the focus of this, the portrait is more about the relation between Charlie Graf and Jürgen Bock, the Red Army fraction terrorists, because they spent some time together in Stammheim in the prison. I'm just wondering, what do you think about this film, and how Ein Deutscher Boxer? What do you think about this film? Because obviously you know more about his biography and so forth.
Yeah. I've not read the autobiography, but I saw the film. It was screened in Germany, I think, last week, maybe. I saw it last week, and I was just amazed. At first, I was a little disappointed because I wanted more historical facts about his growing up, especially because, for me, it was very important because I know the clipping with this little boy sitting on his mother's lap, the interview. I've known this for years, and suddenly I have the adult person telling the story behind this clip, and today, and about the question, and this will be maybe a future talk, like really comparing, so the stories of adoptees to the United States, the children who grew up in children's homes in Germany, and the children who grew up with their mothers, because we don't know like this much about the 70%. I mean, these like over 3,000 children growing up with their mothers or grandparents, and they stayed in the country, and they have a history too. We don't know much about it, and unfortunately, Graf is an example for where it really didn't work out, because his mother was an alcoholic. She had like changing partners. He got beaten up. He grew up in the Benz barracks in Mannheim, which is it's a ghetto. So his luck was that he at 17 already he became a very famous boxer, and so the film is mostly about his career as a boxer, but in the context of, and that is very interesting, he was, because of his taking or dealing with drugs, he was a pimp for a long time. So he got into jail, and he was in jail for 10 or 12 years, but he was sharing his cell with one of the RAF terrorists. Do you remember his name? Yeah. Yeah, and he is interviewed too, and the two of them, I mean, they're just such an interesting couple to share their lives in a very small place, and I think it was a very fruitful relationship. I think they learned a lot from each other, and Graf says that without his cell partner, he would not be the person he is today. I mean, he learned about respect for others, self-respect, about, he read a lot, he, you know, I mean, he just, I think he says the prison, well, he's grateful for the time in prison, because otherwise he would have, God knows what it would have happened to him. And I liked, what I really, really liked, and what made me just, think is that he, and that is very special, he was allowed to leave the prison for one day to fight for the German Meisterschaft. And the director of the prison and his Aufpasser, they came to the fight, and he won, and they were just out of their minds, and they were just like so happy, and they were just cheering. But then he had to go back to jail, and he said two things. One is the reporter, he asked him, so did the people and your mates in the prison, were they happy for you? And he said, yeah, they were happy. They were just banging their cups against the bars. And they were so happy. And these are people who are usually they've not learned to be happy for somebody else's luck. And the second he said is, when I won that fight, is the first time I was just a German. I was not a black guy, I was not coming from the barracks, I was not a problem child, I was not a Mischlingskind, I was not a drug addict, nothing. I was just a German guy who won the German Meisterschaft. And that meant a great deal to him. And so it takes, you know, we could turn it around and say, well, we have to earn the German Meisterschaft to, you know, feel accepted as just German, nothing else.
Got time for one more question. You've had your hand up for a while. Oh, could you wait for the mic?
Thank you for such a moving talk, really. I wanted to ask you to put the experience of the German mixed-race children in perspective, and wonder if you knew anything about the ways in which such mixed-race post-war babies were treated in other European nations. I imagine they were in France and England and so forth, and I'm wondering if there was something that was particularly German about the approach that you've studied, about the way these children were treated, and were they treated any differently in neighboring countries?
Mhm. Wie Vergleich zwischen den verschiedenen Zonen?
Nicht nur innerhalb von Deutschland, aber auch in Nachbarländern.
Yeah. It's actually a dream project of mine to do the comparison, not only to the French and the British and the Russian, but also to the Korean, Japanese, the Vietnamese. And I hope one day we'll have a conference where, you know, we'll have all, I mean, not black German, but black children of black GIs are from all over the world. Wherever American GIs, black GIs were stationed, they had children with the local women. And I'm actually going to a conference in September in Vienna. And it's the first time for me that I will be on a panel with scholars who deal, so there's one who's working on the war baby or the occupation babies from Austrian mothers, and one of the Italian mothers. And so I don't know much about it. I know that in Britain, for example, because I found files in National Archives on Britain, and they're part of the NAACP files. So they're all called brown babies. And when I looked for when I did my research, I just took everything I found. So no matter if the mothers were British or French. And so I have quite a little bit of material, and it seemed to me from what I looked through is that there have been like private homes everywhere, even in England, just like in France. So there are a lot of similarities. And at the same time, I think you really have to look closely at each particular history of the country where the children were born in, and the German one in particular is very, very different from the French one and from the British one. Because Germany had National Socialism and a long history of black Germans, and Tina Kant wrote a book about the so-called Rhineland children that were born to the soldiers who were stationed in the Rhineland after the First World War. Some of them were sterilized, some of them were in disguise, in uniforms. I mean, that's a whole different story, but I think we shouldn't. I know that there was, many years ago, the initiative of Black German, there was a big discussion on if we shouldn't change our name from Afro-German, aren't we all Afro-Europeans? That was when, you know, we had the Euro coming, and it was all like these young, I call them the young Afro-German. They said, well, no, I'm not Afro-German, I'm Afro-European. And so why do you stick to Afro-German, and are you proud of your German passport? I was like, so I don't know if I'm old-fashioned or because I'm a historian or because I think that we should not just mix up things. Every and each historical context is very important to look at and see the children in this context, because that's what it's all about, you know. So I'd like to do that, to make the comparison and to find out the differences, but also, and you know, what's common, what's similar and what's different. But I'd really like to not mix it up, like, oh, in Europe, you know, the black kids, they're like this.
Well, it's very, very hard to end this discussion, but I'm going to have to do it. To keep us on time for our last panel, I'm going to ask that we just take a 15-minute break. There is coffee over here so that you can wake up. So we're going to reconvene here at 3.
Okay.